Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Shao, and I am the president of the William F. Buckley Jr. program at Yale. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our first event since the pandemic has started. So our first event in 2 years, a book talk with Jason Reilly on Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell. For our first in-person public event since March 2020, we're fortunate to be joined by the biographer, Mr. Reilly, who is the first to give Sowell, one of the greatest social theorists of the past century, his due, and showcases Sowell's ideas and life story. A special thank you to Professor Noel Vallis, who has sponsored this event and made it possible during COVID. Professor Vallis, thank you so much for being here and for making all of this possible and making our return to in-person possible. Now, before we begin the talk, I'd like to say a few words about the Buckley program. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We have hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. Our over 400 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website at buckleyprogram.com. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest for today's discussion. Jason Reilly is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. After joining the journal in 1994, he was named a senior editorial page writer in 2000 and a member of the editorial board in 2005. He is the author of numerous books, including Please Stop Helping Us, The Black Boom, and Maverick. Mr. Reilly will first deliver some opening remarks about his biography, the biography of Professor Sowell, and then I'll move on to questions from myself and the audience. When we get to the Q&A portion, please feel free to raise your hand, and then we will get one of the microphones over to you. Just a heads up, this event is being live streamed, so your questions will go out to everyone on the live stream who couldn't join us today. Now, with that, please join me in welcoming Jason Reilly to Yale and to the Buckley program.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and I want to thank all of you for being here. Before the pandemic, I did a fair amount of speaking on college campuses when they let me speak on college campuses. That is, so it's nice to be back in person addressing students. I'm also grateful for programs like the Buckley program, extremely grateful, which I think are more important than ever at a time when our colleges and universities are getting more and more intellectually intolerant. A few years ago, the University of Chicago began sending out letters to incoming freshmen, explaining the school's commitment to academic freedom, how it does not support trigger warnings or safe spaces or cancel invited speakers because what they say might be controversial. That used to go without saying on college campuses. Now it needs to be stated explicitly in writing to incoming students, which I think says something about where we are on college campuses today. College ought to be a space where students are exposed to different points of view, where their sensibilities are challenged, where they learn to grapple with alternative perspectives and formulate coherent responses, where you learn the difference between a slogan and an argument. On a lot of campuses, that's not happening, or at least it's not happening to the extent that it should be. Instead, students are being taught what to think instead of how to think, and they're being encouraged to silence or cancel people they disagree with rather than debate them. All of which makes the Buckley program, I believe, not only important but essential in today's environment. And I'm very honored to be here. I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about the economist Thomas Sowell, someone who's had a huge influence on my own journalism, and why so much of his scholarship continues to be relevant to our public policy debates today. When I was researching the book, I kept coming across Sowell's own descriptions of scholars he admired. And I was often struck by how well those descriptions applied to Sowell himself. For example, after the Nobel Prize-winning economist George Stigler, who was one of Tom's professors at the University of Chicago, passed away, Tom wrote this: "In a world of self-promoting academics, George Stigler epitomized a rare integrity as well as a rare intellect. He jumped on no bandwagon, beat no drum for causes, created no personal cult. He did the work of a scholar and a teacher, both superbly, and found that sufficient. If you wanted to learn, and above all, if you wanted to learn how to think, how to avoid vague words, fuzzy thoughts, maudlin sentiments that cloud over reality, then Stigler was your man." Or here's Tom describing another one of his mentors, Milton Friedman, whom he also studied under at Chicago. Friedman, he said, was one of the few intellectuals with both genius and common sense. He could express himself at the highest analytical levels to fellow economists in academic publications and still write popular books that could be readily understood by people who knew nothing about economics. I'm hard-pressed to come up with better ways than those to describe Thomas Sowell. When I think of his scholarship, whether the subject is economics or history or culture or race or political philosophy, that is what comes to mind: intellectual integrity, analytical rigor, respect for evidence, skepticism toward the kind of fashionable thinking that comes and goes. And then there's the clarity in column after column, book after book, written in plain English for general public consumption. In 2020, at the age of 90, Sowell published book number 36. The title is Charter Schools and Their Enemies. And I hope Tom's not done writing books. But if he is, you could hardly find a more suitable swan song for a publishing career that has now spanned 6 decades. Sowell's first 2 books were delivered or directed at students of economics, but his third book, the Semi-Autobiographical Black Education, Myths and Tragedies, was published in 1972 and written for the general public. It grew out of a long article on college admission standards for black students that he wrote for the New York Times Magazine in 1970 after leaving his teaching post at Cornell. And it begins with a recounting of his own education, first at segregated schools in North Carolina where he was born, and later at integrated schools in New York City's Harlem neighborhood where he was raised. The topic of education, both at the K through 12 and college level, is one that he's returned to repeatedly in his books over the decades. And in the preface to Charter Schools and Their Enemies, he describes a conversation he had in the early 1970s with Irving Kristol, who was the editor of a quarterly called The Public Interest at the time. And when Kristol asked Sowell what could be done to create high-quality schools for blacks, Sowell responded that such schools already existed and had, in fact, for generations. And Kristol asked Sowell to write about these schools for the magazine. And a 1974 issue of The Public Interest featured a long essay by Sowell on the history of all-black Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C., which had not only outperformed its local white counterparts there in Washington, but had repeatedly equaled or exceeded national norms and standardized tests throughout the first half of the 20th century. Over an 85-year span, from 1870 to 1955, Sowell wrote, most of Dunbar's graduates went on to college, even though most Americans, white or black, did not. 2 years later, in the same publication, Sowell wrote a second article on successful black elementary and high schools located throughout the country. In a sense, today's public charter schools, which often have predominantly low-income black and Hispanic students, are successors to these high-achieving black schools that Sowell researched more than 40 years ago. And as he points out, what's clear is that these charter schools are not simply doing a better job than their traditional public schools with the same demographic groups. In many cases, inner-city charter students are outperforming their peers in the wealthiest and whitest suburban school districts in the country. In New York City, for example, where I'm based, the Success Academy charter schools have effectively closed the academic gap between black and white students. As Sowell explains, quote, The educational success of these charter schools undermines theories of genetic determinism. It undermines claims of cultural bias in test. It undermines assertions that black students need to be sitting next to white students in order to learn. It undermines the presumption that family income differences explain differences in education outcomes. Now, in recent years, charter school skeptics have made headway in this country. Limits have been placed on how many can open and where they can be located. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama both supported charter schools, but Democrats and progressives have moved sharply to the left on education more recently. And the rhetoric coming out of the Biden administration is far more skeptical of charter schools, all of which makes Sowell's book as timely as anything he's ever written. In fact, so much of Sowell's scholarship, not just on education, remains relevant to our policy debates today. We're still talking about economic inequality, affirmative action, social justice, critical race theory, slavery reparations, the efficacy of minimum wage laws, the pros and cons of immigration, and so forth. Sowell's writings have addressed all of these topics. Frankly, I find it depressing that so many people know names like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram Kendi and Nicole Hannah-Jones and Cornel West, but not Thomas Sowell. His scholarship runs circles around those individuals, maybe around all of them put together, frankly. But it's not just the volume of his writings that surpasses those other individuals. It's also the range and the depth and the rigor of his thinking, which they don't come close to matching in their own analyses. He anticipated many of their arguments decades ago and refuted them decades ago. In some cases, before the people making them today were even born. To the extent that Sowell is known, it's mostly for his writings on racial controversies. But most of his books are not on racial themes. And Sowell would have distinguished himself as a first-rate scholar even if he'd never written a single word about race and ethnicity. Another reason I wanted to write the book was to showcase his writings in these other areas. He's an economist by training, specializing in the history of economic thought and the history of ideas. But he's also a sociologist, a political philosopher, social theorist. One person described him as one of our great intellectual trespassers, someone unafraid to go wherever his talent takes him. Sowell says his favorite of his own books is titled A Conflict of Visions. And if you want to get inside of Tom's head, that's certainly the book to read. It's a book about the history of ideas. He tries to explain what drives our ideological disputes about freedom, equality, and justice. And he traces these visions or divergent views of human nature back at least 2 centuries. Thinkers like William Godwin, Immanuel Kant, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and down through John Rawls and the social justice theorist of today. The conflicting or contrasting visions he describes in the book are the constrained, or sometimes he calls it the tragic, view of human nature, and the unconstrained, or utopian, view. Now, people with a more constrained view of the human condition see mankind as hopelessly flawed. They see inherent limits to human betterment. We may want to end war or poverty or racism, for example, but that's probably not going to happen. Therefore, our focus should be on putting in place institutions and processes that help us best deal with problems we're probably never going to solve entirely. On the other side, you have this unconstrained or utopian view of human nature, which essentially rejects the idea that there are limits to what humans can achieve. This is the belief that nothing is unattainable, and moreover, there are no trade-offs necessary. Everything is available to all who want it. According to this perspective, through the proper amount of reason and willpower, we can not only manage problems like inequality and racism, but solve them entirely. In A Conflict of Vision, Sowell argues that depending on which view you embrace, there are a whole host of public policies you're likely to support or oppose. He explains why 2 people, similarly well-informed and similarly well-meaning, will reach opposite conclusions, not just on a given issue, but on a whole range of issues: taxes, rent control, school choice, military spending, judicial activism, and so forth. When Kant said that from the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made, he was exhibiting that constrained view. When Rousseau said that man is born free, but everywhere in chains, he was voicing the unconstrained view. When Oliver Wendell Holmes said that his job as a justice was to make sure that the game is played according to the rules, whether he liked them or not. It was a constrained view of jurisprudence. But when Earl Warren said that his job as a justice was to do what he thinks is right, regardless of the law, it was an unconstrained view. This is the philosophical framework, the template, so to speak, that explains Sowell's writings on almost any topic, from economics to migration to education, race, culture. If you really want to understand where he's coming from, conflict of visions is where he really lays it out. Now, beginning in the 1970s, Sowell turned his attention to racial controversies. He did so, he says, out of a sense of duty, that there were things that needed to be said and too few who were willing to say them, or at least say them out loud in public. Tom's criticisms of the direction of the civil rights movement at the time eventually got him canceled, to use today's terms. Black elites in particular wanted nothing to do with him because he opposed affirmative action. And they convinced others in the mainstream media not to take Tom's views seriously, not to turn to him for a black point of view on the issues of the day. Sowell has long argued that the problems blacks face today involve far more than what whites have done to them in the past. It's no mystery why black activists want to keep the focus on white racism. It helps them raise money and stay relevant. And it's no mystery why politicians use the same tactics. It helps them win votes. But Sowell argued that it's not at all clear that a laser focus on white racism is helping the black underclass. You can spend all day, every day, pointing out the moral failings of other people, other groups, institutions, society in general. The question is whether doing so helps the people who most need help. Many of today's activists go about their business with the assumption that the only real problem facing the black underclass is white racism. And Sowell has rejected that view. A good example of this is the recent focus on policing in black communities. Do racist cops exist? Absolutely. Do some cops abuse their authority? Of course they do. But are poor black communities so violent because of racist cops or police brutality? And will reducing police resources really solve the situation? Or even improve it? According to the Chicago Sun-Times, there were 492 homicides in Chicago in 2019. Do you know how many of them involved the police? 3. 3 out of 492. If police use of lethal force is a problem in Chicago, it is clearly a secondary problem. During one weekend in Chicago a few years ago, 74 people were shot. One of the local hospital emergency rooms had to shut down, turn away ambulances, because it didn't have room for any more bodies. Again, none of these shootings involved cops, not one. Young black men in Chicago or Baltimore or St. Louis may indeed leave the house each morning worrying about getting shot, but not by a police officer. Will reducing police resources really address this problem? And more importantly, is that what people who live in these high crime neighborhoods actually want? Fewer police? Last year there was a ballot measure put to voters in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed, that would have defunded the police in that city. Not only was it defeated, it was most strongly opposed by black residents in high crime areas of the city who want more policing, not less. And the black residents of Minneapolis are not outliers. They're typical. In a Gallup poll released in 2020, 81% of blacks nationwide said they wanted the police presence in their neighborhoods to remain the same or to increase. 81%. Another Gallup poll released a year earlier asked Black and Hispanic residents of low-income neighborhoods in particular about policing. 59% of both Blacks and Hispanics said they wanted police to spend more time in their community. 59%. Efforts to defund the police are being pushed by activists and liberal elites who claim to be speaking on behalf of these low-income minorities. But as the polling shows, they are mostly speaking for themselves. This is something Sowell pointed out a long time ago. While doing research for the book, I went through scores of interviews that Sowell had done over the decades. And he would often be asked how it felt to go against the grain of so many other Blacks. Sowell would inevitably correct the premise of the question. You don't mean I go against the grain of most Blacks, he would say. You mean I go against the grain of most Black intellectuals, most Black elites. But Black intellectuals don't represent most Blacks any more than white intellectuals represent most whites, he would say. This continues to be the case today. Most Blacks, for example, support voter ID laws and school choice, while most Black elites, your academics, your NAACP, your Black Lives Matter protesters, and so forth, oppose those things. Conversely, most Blacks oppose racial preferences in college admissions and, as I just pointed out, oppose defunding law enforcement, while most Black elites are in favor of those things. Sowell pointed out these disparities decades ago, and they've only grown since then. His writings on intellectual history have stressed over and over that intellectuals are a special interest group with their own self-serving agenda and priorities and ought to be understood as such. I often tell people that if you think Ta-Nehisi Coates and Nicole Hannah-Jones represent the views of most Black people, you need to get to know more Black people. Sowell has been right about this for a very long time. So why does Tom Sowell still matter? Well, here's why. Sowell is now 91 years old. The book he published last year, as I mentioned, was book number 36, and his fifth since turning 80. That's not too bad for a Black orphan from the Jim Crow South who was born into extreme poverty during the Great Depression, who never finished high school, who didn't earn a college degree until he was 28 years old, and who didn't write his first book until he was 40. But even aside from that impressive personal journey, Sowell is a rare species. He's an honest intellectual. He's someone who has consistently sought out the truth regardless of whether it made him popular. He's been willing to follow the facts and evidence where they lead, even when they lead to politically incorrect results. It's not something that ought to distinguish you as a scholar, but these days it does. Think about the current debate we're having over critical race theory. These ideas were once relegated to college seminars. Now they're entering our workplaces through diversity training. And they're entering our elementary schools through the New York Times 1619 Project, which attempts to put the institution of slavery at the center of America's founding, which is absurd. Slavery existed for thousands of years in societies all over the world, long before the founding of the United States. More African slaves were sent to the Islamic world than were ever sent to America. Slavery still exists in parts of Nigeria and Sudan today. What makes America unique is not slavery, it's emancipation. It's how fast we went from slavery to a Martin Luther King, to a Barack Obama. The economic and social progress of Black Americans in only a few generations is something historians have described as unmatched in recorded history. That's what makes America unique. These facts about slavery are well known. among serious historians. But where are these serious historians right now? A few have come forward. People like Sean Wilentz and Gordon Wood and James McPherson come to mind, and some others. But why so relatively few? Why isn't the head of every history department at every major university pushing back against the 1619 Project being peddled by the New York Times and Nicole Hannah-Jones, and now infiltrating our K-12 school system? The nation's top scholars ought to be falling over one another denouncing this stuff. Why have so many been so quiet? There have been countless books written by serious scholars about our nation's founding. None of those books have been written by Nicole Hannah-Jones. Why are serious historians so afraid to take on a journalist who's never written a book, never written a serious academic paper about anything, let alone about the history of slavery and the nation's founding? The reason they're so afraid of her is because taking her on is politically incorrect. They will be called racist, sexist. It might damage their academic careers, might cost them their careers. This is the sort of intellectual cowardice that makes Sowell's life and work unique. This is what distinguishes his scholarship. Sowell wasn't afraid. It's the sort of thing that ought to be commonplace among scholars and intellectuals and journalists, for that matter. But clearly it is not. Sowell has spent a career putting truth above popularity, and I think we need 100 more just like him. Thank you.
You need to put on this mask before you gets angry at me. But if you have any questions, we'll be passing around this mic. Just raise your hand and we'll give it over to you. For starters, for a question for Mr. Reilly, do you think that Professor Sowell's work has made an impact upon the black community? And if so, how do you see it play out tangibly?
I don't think it's had as much of an impact as I'd like, but I think the real point is that, as I tried to get across, a lot of his views on these matters are in fact reflections of the views within the black community. It's often not presented that way, particularly in the media, where the people you see on the cable chat shows and hear on the radio and so forth and read in the New York Times are people claiming to represent the views of the majority of blacks, when in fact the data shows that they do not, in case after case after case, and haven't for decades. So, I think Sowell's done a public service in simply pointing this out, this disparity between the views of people who claim to represent the interests of blacks and the views of black people themselves, at least as measured through what they tell pollsters.
One of the interesting things that I've noticed with minority intellectuals in particular is that they kind of set up a network of influence among one another. Like, I know that Clarence Thomas was inspired by Thomas Sowell, and I know that people like modern public figures like Candace Owens often point to them as being inspirations as well. Why do you think that, like, this tends to happen? How can we make this happen more? And, like, is the relationship between minorities and the conservative intellectual movement in a good place right now? How can it get better? I'm curious what you think about this.
Well, again, I don't think it's unique to blacks. This is a difference between elites in general and everyday people. That's the overriding point here. You have to look at the intellectual class as such, and distinguish their agenda. You can't assume they have the best interest of everyone in mind. They're just great people. They respond to incentives just like the rest of us do. And I think that is too often lost in the mix when the media turns to the same people over and over again to represent the interest. I mean, among Hispanics, For example, there have been debates for decades over bilingual education. Most parents do not want bilingual education, but academic elites do want it and have pushed it on behalf of those parents. And so these again, it's not a situation I think that's unique at all the blacks. You mentioned Clarence Thomas. Just to follow up on that. Thomas is someone who sort of discovered Sowell after he started thinking the way he was already thinking about a lot of these issues. And I had a similar experience. I discovered Tom's writings in college in the early 1990s. And I worked on the school paper and was having a conversation with some of my colleagues on the paper about affirmative action. And someone said, "Jason, you sound like Tom Sowell." And I said, "Tom who?" And he wrote down the name of a book on a sheet of paper, and I went to the school library that afternoon and checked it out and read it that evening in one sitting. And it was incredible. And I mean, I didn't have the language, I didn't have the knowledge of the research out there, I didn't have the data. Sowell filled all that in. But in terms of the instincts, something's wrong here. This isn't quite right. Yeah, this makes a lot more sense than what I've been hearing. That was already there, and it was a similar experience with Clarence Thomas. It was a similar experience with Walter Williams, another black economist, libertarian-leaning, who passed away recently. They met for the first time out at UCLA when Walter Williams was in graduate school and Tom was teaching there. But Walter Williams was already Walter Williams before he met Thomas Sowell. He just found a soulmate. And there was something of that as well in Clarence Thomas. Another thing that's interesting about that history is all of those individuals, like Tom, started on the left, and not just slightly left of center. Sowell was a Marxist all through college, even while studying under Milton Friedman and George Stigler at the University of Chicago. Clarence Thomas was a Black Panther in college. Walter Williams was someone whose views were much more sympathetic to those of Malcolm X than Martin Luther King. Shelby Steele, another race scholar at the Hoover Institution, was a radical leftist in the 1960s. So it's interesting that these individuals all made this move to the right over time, but it does show that, or demonstrate that when they talk about the left, they know what they're talking about from personal experience.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Reilly. You mentioned a couple times the discrepancy between the interests of minority intellectuals and normal people. I'm wondering if you could specify what the interests of the intellectuals are and
Sure.
why they lead to such different proposals in terms of policy.
I'll give you an example. Critical race theory, I think, would be a pretty relevant example to this. This is something that came out of the 1970s law schools where this was pushed. Individuals like Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, Richard Delgado were pushing this. And they were essentially pushing it as an argument in favor of affirmative action in hiring, in higher education. Critical race theory was a justification for this. This was made explicit in a famous law review article written by Randall Kennedy of Harvard Law School back in, let's say, 1989, 1990, right around then. He names names, all three of the individuals I mentioned, and he calls them out on this. He says, this is a self-serving argument you are making in favor of racial preferences. When he shopped this law review article around for comments from people before he submitted it, they urged him not to publish it because it would undermine their argument for affirmative action. It was too critical. So that is an example of self-serving a self-serving interest of elites pushing something in the name of the masses. And we know from experience, we have empirical evidence. When it comes to something like affirmative action, it has mostly redounded to the benefit of people who were already better off to begin with, even though it is sold in the name of helping the underclass, helping the poor. And even when it comes to helping middle-class blacks, it's backfired in many cases, and I'll give you an example of that. After the University of California banned the use of racial preferences in college admissions back in the mid-1990s, black college graduation rates in California went up. They had been falling in the 80s. They went up. They went up for Hispanics too, and not by a little bit. They went up by more than 50%. So here, a policy sold as a way of increasing the ranks of the black middle class had in practice resulted in fewer doctors and lawyers and engineers than we would have had in the absence of the policy. So, but that would be an example of elites selling something in the name of the masses, but really out of self-interest. By the way, I highly recommend that law review article by Kennedy. And it's also noteworthy because Kennedy is a man of the left. Kennedy is not Clarence Thomas. Kennedy is as bona fide liberal credentials that very few would question. But he's an honest liberal. He was an honest intellectual in the sense that Sowell is when it comes to just calling it straight, calling it as you see it. But yeah.
How would Sowell think about the concepts of institutional racism and systemic racism and how those are used today?
Well, I'm sure he thinks they're overused. I mean, and again, you're talking about someone who was, grew up in the Jim Crow era. Sowell has been, denied, told he can't live in certain neighborhoods, eat in certain restaurants, attend certain schools. This is his personal experience. And I think he would consider that institutional racism. But his major point on this is that, yes, racism exists. The question is whether it sufficiently explains the disparities we see today, or whether something else is a bigger factor in driving those disparities. And his claim is that other factors play a bigger role. And a laser focus on discrimination is not going to get people where we think it's going to get them, or at least those people who claim that racism is the biggest barrier. And by the way, this is something, this idea has been around for a long time. W.E.B. Du Bois was writing about this 100 years ago in the Philadelphia Negro. He said, if white people lost their prejudices overnight, he said a few blacks might benefit from that, but the vast majority would not. He said that 100 years ago. And the reason was the underdevelopment among blacks in the areas of attitudes and habits and behavior, cultural development. Human capital is what economists call it. But this was pointed out 100 years ago. And Sowell says this remains the case today. He also takes an international perspective on this because obviously blacks aren't the only people that have ever been discriminated against. So how have other groups fared? Has it been a sufficient barrier to other ethnic and racial minority groups? And you can go through example after example of such groups that have not only overcome being despised by the surrounding society. In the case of Asians, you're talking about lynchings, being denied access to certain professions, being denied out west land ownership, property rights, segregated schools, both here in the US and in Canada, treated horribly. Asians today outperform whites in this country, both academically and economically, and have for decades. The same could be said, of course, for Jews not only here in the US, but throughout Europe, throughout the world. Same can be said about the ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia. Another hated group, discriminated against, banned from certain professions, banned from certain schools, yet managed to not only overcome that, but to exceed, in terms of performance, the group that has oppressed them. It's happened time and time and time again. And Sowell looks at this history and says, what this tells me is that while prejudice and racism may still exist today and can impact a group's upward mobility, we can't use racism as a blanket explanation every time we see a racial disparity. There are other factors that we need to look at, and that those other factors often get little or no attention in our policy discussions.
Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time and coming here to talk with us. My question is, harking back to the idea of the discrepancy between the black intellectuals and the black communities. How do you reconcile this discrepancy with the fact that 97% of black Americans voted for, 97% of them have voted for Obama, and 93% of them voting for Hillary Clinton, and 90% of them voting for President Biden? Does this not show that they're actually on the same side instead of having a difference between their opinions?
Sure, sure. Well, again, this is not a phenomenon unique to blacks. There's an old saying, much older than you guys, about Jews earning like Episcopalians and voting like Puerto Ricans. And what the saying is illustrating is that if you vote your pocketbook, you wouldn't be voting for Democrats. But Hollywood liberals do, even though they know those Democrats are going to raise their taxes and all the rest. Another example, a more recent example, to use Asians again, last year, well, we're in 2022, in 2020, there was a ballot initiative in California that would have reimposed the racial preferences in college admissions that California had banned back in the mid-90s that I spoke about earlier. The ballot initiative was shot down. It was defeated quite easily. Asians led the charge in defeating it. Those same Asians voted overwhelmingly for President Biden. So blacks are not unique in having different priorities when it comes to choosing who they're going to vote for. And from an outsider's perspective, it might seem very obvious who blacks should be voting for. And why aren't they doing that? They're behaving so irrationally here. But it's complicated. One reason I think you don't see more blacks voting for Republicans is that Republicans rarely court black voters. They don't go into black neighborhoods and campaign, by and large. They're not at barbershops or community centers, churches. They don't advertise on black radio, black television, black Twitter. They largely write off this vote. And those few Republicans that have bothered to go court black voters have historically found that it's worth it. But Republicans know they can still win elections without these voters. And time spent courting voters you might not get as time not spent courting voters you have a more likely chance of getting. And so I think they're playing the odds there. But I think it's complicated. But there are many reasons why I think blacks vote the way they do. I mean, to blacks of a certain age, conservatism is associated with segregation in the Jim Crow South, and so I don't see them as gettable for the GOP. But among younger blacks, college-age blacks, I think they are more gettable. In fact, in his re-election bid, although he lost, Trump did significantly better, particularly among Hispanics and black men, than he had in 2016. And I think it had to do mostly with how blacks were faring economically prior to the pandemic. You saw record low black unemployment, record low black poverty rates. You saw black wages rising at a faster rate than white wages at the time. And I think that was reflected in how some blacks voted in terms of Trump's reelection. So, but until I think until Republicans go and court this vote and feel they need it, I don't see the current voting patterns changing significantly.
Thank you. So at the beginning of the talk, you talked a bit about how Sowell's books, while they mostly focused on economics and how his initial books were mostly intended for students or people trained in economics, and how his most recent book that focused on charter schools was a pivot to a kind of style of writing that was more so intended for public consumption. And you described this as an appropriate swan song for a well-lived life and good career. In your research into his works and life, did you find out anything about why he chose to pivot in this certain way? Like, did he believe that this topic needed to be written about at this time, for example?
Well, a couple things. Tom's first two books were directed at students of economics. The first book was an actual economics textbook, graphs and charts for college undergraduates. And then he published, which was essentially his dissertation, a book called Say's Law, which is about economic history. Those are his first two books, and then he wrote the semi-biographical book. But throughout his career, he has gone back to writing about his first love, which is classical economics. I mean, he's most at home writing about, John Stuart Mill and Adam Smith and David Ricardo and folks like that, and that's what he's returned to repeatedly over the decades. But most of his books have been written for general consumption. And he said he's done that because it's something I think he got from his mentors at Chicago, particularly Milton Friedman, who after leaving teaching wrote popular books, wrote a magazine column for Time magazine for a number of years as well, and did so because he felt economic literacy was so important, and that intellectuals and scholars shouldn't spend all their time just talking to one another, that they should be explaining their discipline to non-economists. And Tom took that to heart, and I think that's has really informed his public intellectualism over the decades. In terms of his personal pivot away from the Marxism, he says the defining moment for him was a job in government in the 1960s. Or he was working at the Department of Labor on minimum wage laws in Puerto Rico, and noticed the disemployment effects of these laws. And furthermore, that the government didn't much care about what he found here. They were going to support minimum wage laws regardless of the disemployment effects, or who was being harmed, or who wasn't being hired in the first place. And it caused him to question not just minimum wage laws, which he supported at the time, but government benevolence in general, and how the government has its own biases and incentives and so forth to push things regardless of whether or not they're making things better or worse. And so that was the beginning of his turn away from his Marxism and from socialism more generally. But throughout his 30s, I mean, all through his 20s, it wasn't until the beginning of his 30s that he really moved away from that. So this wasn't a sort of youthful indiscretion. He was a serious Marxist, taught Marx, wrote a book on Marx. He's one of those Marx, he was someone who was not only identified as a Marxist, but was a true Marx scholar at the time, which makes him a bit unique in that sense. But throughout his career, personal experience has informed his intellectualism. He's had a unique upbringing. He had a unique upbringing. He has lived a life that is quite different from your typical academic. And that has certainly informed his scholarship over the years. He's drawn on that personal experience, and so yeah, he's been very upfront about that. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. So you alluded to this a little bit, but I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more depth about if racism doesn't and discrimination doesn't explain the disparities, what are some other things that might? You know, what is different about the black group than the Jewish group or the Asian group? You know, what might those things be?
Well, I can give you an example of how race may not, or racism may not explain a disparity. The black poverty rate. Black poverty rate in the U.S. is, for decades, has been about a third higher than the white poverty rate. But among black married couples, black poverty is in the single digits and has been for close to 30 years. So is the black poverty rate a reflection of racism or family formation? What's playing a bigger role? I mean, so that would be an example of us seeing a disparity, blacks, whites, therefore racism must be at play here. Mortgage lending. Blacks receive bank loans at lower rates than whites. Racism. But whites receive mortgage loans at lower rates than Asians. Wait a minute. Are mortgage lenders anti-white? Suspension rates in schools. Blacks are suspended at higher rates than whites. Whites are suspended at higher rates than Asians. So this, too often, people read the data up until it justifies their prejudice, and then they stop reading or stop reporting the rest of the results. And it I think, has a negative impact on how public policies are analyzed. If you're working out of a framework that all racial disparities can be ascribed to racism, it's going to take you in a very different direction policy-wise than if that is not your initial, that is not the initial conclusion you jump to.
Thank you so much for coming out here, Mr. Reilly. I just wanted to ask, do you or Mr. Sowell think that there's a difference between black political, I guess, advancement versus black economic advancement, or are they inextricably linked to each other?
Well, Sowell's argument is that economic advancement is more important. And one of the disputes he had with the civil rights movement beginning in the late 60s and certainly into the 70s was that black leaders pivoted away from a focus on the development of human capital, economic advancement, educational advancement, and toward more achieving more political clout. Let me back up a second here. I gave some examples of other racial and ethnic minority groups who had risen from poverty to prosperity, notwithstanding the fact that they had been discriminated against. And a lot of times people don't like comparisons between blacks and immigrants, or blacks and other racial and ethnic groups. They feel blacks have this unique history, and it is a unique history, particularly in this country, and that those comparisons are just apples and oranges, and you can't compare blacks to Jews or Asians or anybody else. And there's some validity. They're not perfect apples-to-apples comparisons. But what my response to those folks is you can compare black advancement today to black advancement of a previous era. And there you do have much more of an apples-to-apples comparison. And And if you look at black economic advancement in the first half of the 20th century, you saw things like higher black marriage rates than white marriage rates throughout the 1910s and 20s and 30s and 40s. You saw black earnings growing faster than white earnings in the 1940s and 50s. You saw blacks leaving poverty at faster rates than whites in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. All of these trends would slow, stall, or in some cases reverse following the Great Society programs, the government welfare state expansions of the 1960s, particularly under Lyndon Johnson. But the disparities we see today, to the extent that they've remained or grown, it's hard to attribute them to the legacy of racism or Jim Crow, when generations of blacks who were living through Jim Crow and much closer to the institution of slavery were moving up faster, at faster rates. One of Sowell's explanations for why that black progress slowed was his belief that following essentially the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the emphasis of the black leadership moved to electing more black officials. That became a primary goal. No longer the educational achievement, no longer the economic achievement. They didn't ignore that entirely, but the main focus became we must get more blacks in office. If we do that, the rest will take care of itself, socioeconomically. And so that became the focus, culminating, of course, in the election of Obama. But that had been the focus since the late 1960s. And it's been quite successful on its own terms, even before the election of Obama. In other words, by the 1980s and 90s, you had blacks running large cities in the US with large black populations. Your Los Angeleses, your New Yorks, your Clevelands, your Chicagos, your Detroits, your Washington, D.C.s. Elected black mayors, black police chiefs, black school superintendents, black governors. But that political clout never translated into the economic advancement that we were promised. And if you look at the data, if you look at how the blacks fared in Marion Barry's Washington, D.C., or Sharp James's Newark, New Jersey, or Coleman Young's Detroit in the 1960s, the black poor got poorer on their watch. Which is not to say blacks shouldn't seek office. It is to say that political clout does not naturally translate into economic advancement. And that's the lesson that Sowell has drawn. And that's why he has, he saw this coming way back in the 1960s, as I point out in the book, that this was barking up the wrong tree, this effort to seek government, political clout and then government favors, affirmative action, preferences, quotas, and so forth. That was the direction the civil rights movement took in the 1960s. And he said that's not going to do what they think it's going to do. And it hasn't. And it hasn't. So, he's come down firmly on the development, economic development of a people. And that is traditionally, and again, this gets into the comparisons with other racial and ethnic minority groups. Traditionally in this country, that has been the course for racial and ethnic minorities. That's what Jews did, that's what Italians did, that's what Germans did. The exception were the Irish, who had tremendous early political success. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, you have the Irish political machines running your Philadelphias, your San Franciscos, your Bostons, your New Yorks, but there was no real Irish middle class to speak of at the time. And it really wasn't until the decline of those machines that you saw the rise of an Irish middle class, to the point where today, the average Irish person is well above the national average in terms of income and academic achievement and so forth. But it was, which is to say that political clout can get you there eventually, going that route, but it's a much less efficient way of doing it. And blacks have tended to go the route of the Irish, at least so far, and we're seeing the results. And I guess the most recent example, again, would be Asians today, who are outperforming, as I said earlier, whites academically and educationally. I mean, how much political clout do Asians really have in this country? Not nearly as much as blacks do. Yet that does not seem to be a barrier to upward mobility among Asians. And so Sowell would point to that as just another example of a pattern seen among other groups.
Great. Well, unfortunately, I think that's all the time we have for today. But thank you to everyone for coming out. Thank you, Mr. Reilly, for taking
Thank
the
you.
time to travel up here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And of course, thank you, Professor Vallis, for sponsoring us again. It really makes it all a lot better to be in person. So I'm glad to be back. And for students in the room, if you could just scan your ID as you leave, that would be great, so we can track sort of who are the most active Buckley Fellows. And if you're not a Buckley Fellow, then you should sign up on our website. But if you got an email from Libby about dinner, please come and stay after, and we'll walk over to the restaurant right after this. So thank you all for coming.